I was sitting in the break room at Mercy General, still in my scrubs, when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but something made me pick up anyway. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, the kind of calm that people use when they're about to say something that will split your life into before and after. "My name is Gerald Sims," he said. "I'm the estate attorney for your grandfather, Harold Whitfield. He passed 3 days ago, and you are the primary beneficiary of his will." I set my coffee down. "I need you to understand the scope of what I'm telling you," he continued. "The total value of the estate, including the property holdings, the business assets, and the liquid accounts, comes to just under $2 million. All of it goes to you." I didn't say anything for a long moment. I just sat there in that fluorescent-lit break room with the smell of bad coffee and rubber gloves, trying to make those words land somewhere real. My grandfather and I had always been close in the quiet way that skips a generation. He was the one who drove me to the library every Saturday when I was 7. He was the one who sat outside the testing room when I took my nursing boards and brought me flowers either way. My mother never understood it, and my brother understood it even less. To them, my grandfather was a name on a holiday card and a seat at Thanksgiving. To me, he was the reason I believed in anything steady. I told Gerald I needed a day before I could meet with him. He said he understood and that there was no rush, though he did mention, gently but clearly, that I was the only person listed on the documents. No one else had a claim. I thanked him and hung up, and then I sat in that break room for another 20 minutes before my hands stopped shaking. The first thing I felt wasn't excitement. It wasn't even relief. It was a cold, quiet dread that settled right in the center of my chest, because I knew one thing with absolute certainty: my brother would find out, and when he did, nothing would be the same. My brother and I had never been enemies exactly, but we had never been allies either. He was 6 years older than me, and had grown up operating under the assumption that being the firstborn meant being first in everything. When our parents divorced, he stayed with our mother and became her project, her proof that she'd done something right. I went back and forth between houses until I was old enough to decide for myself, and then I mostly stopped going to either. My grandfather's house was the only place that felt like home, and I think my brother always resented that. He saw it as favoritism. I saw it as the one relationship in my family that wasn't conditional. He had called me twice in the past year, once to ask if I could cover part of our mother's car payment because he was between jobs again, once to tell me I thought too highly of myself. Those were the full extent of our recent communication. I told no one about the inheritance for 3 days. I went to work, did my shifts, came home, and met with Gerald on a Wednesday afternoon at his office downtown. He walked me through everything methodically. The 2 properties, one in Nashville where I lived, one a cabin outside of Knoxville that my grandfather had owned since the 1970s. The business, a small commercial printing company he'd run for 30 years that had been sold 2 years prior with the funds sitting in a managed account. The liquid assets, the savings bonds he'd been quietly accumulating since the Reagan administration. Gerald slid the documents across the desk and told me where to sign. I went through every page carefully, the way my grandfather had taught me to read anything before I put my name on it. When I was done, Gerald closed the folder and said, "Your grandfather was very specific about his intentions. He wanted this to be simple. He wanted it to be yours." I thanked him and walked out into the afternoon air, and for about 45 minutes I felt something close to peace. Then my phone rang. It was my mother. She didn't say hello. She said, "Gerald Sims called my brother, and I want to know why your grandfather would do this." I stopped walking. He didn't call my brother. Gerald would never do that, which meant someone else had been making calls. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about, and I ended the call before she could push further. Then I called Gerald back immediately. He was quiet for a moment after I told him what my mother had said. "I haven't called anyone," he said carefully, "but I should tell you that your brother contacted this office 2 days ago asking about the status of the estate." I told him I could only speak to the named beneficiary. He wasn't happy about that, so my brother already knew, or had suspected enough to go digging, and now whatever slim window I'd had for handling this quietly was closed. I went home that evening and did the things I knew needed doing. I changed the passwords on my bank accounts. I turned on 2-factor authentication on everything. I called my landlord and told him not to let anyone into my apartment regardless of the reason. These felt like small, almost paranoid steps, but I'd worked enough emergency shifts to know what desperation looks like in people, and I knew my brother's particular brand of it very well. He showed up 3 days later. I didn't buzz him in. He called from the sidewalk and left a voicemail that started with, "I just want to talk," and ended with, "You owe the family a conversation." I didn't call back. What I didn't expect was what happened the following morning. I woke up on a Saturday feeling wrong in a way I couldn't name. Not sick exactly, but off. Like the air in my apartment had gotten thin overnight. I made coffee, drank half of it, and decided a walk would help. I got as far as the end of my block before the pain hit. It started behind my sternum and spread fast, not sharp but crushing, the kind that makes your body go very still while your brain tries to catch up. I sat down on the edge of a planter outside a dry cleaner and called 911 myself because I am a nurse, and I knew exactly what that feeling could mean. The paramedics arrived in 4 minutes. They ran an EKG on the scene and had me in the back of the ambulance before I'd finished explaining my symptoms. At the hospital, the cardiology team moved fast. It wasn't a heart attack. It was an arrhythmia, a severe one, the kind that can resolve or can escalate depending on how quickly you catch it. They caught it. They put me on a monitor, started an IV, and admitted me within the hour. I was 31 years old and I was lying in a hospital bed with wires running off my chest, staring at the ceiling tiles, thinking about how none of the things I'd planned for the next 2 weeks were going to happen on schedule. The attending physician, a cardiologist named Dr. Reyes, came in that afternoon and explained that what I'd experienced was likely stress-induced but could also point to an underlying condition they needed to rule out. She wanted me there for at least 72 hours. I told her I was a nurse and she gave me the look that nurses give other medical people who try to negotiate their own care. I stopped negotiating. I had a semi-private room with a curtain down the middle, though the other side was empty for most of the first day. I texted 2 coworkers to cover my shifts and sent a brief message to Gerald, letting him know I was in the hospital but was fine, and that I'd be in touch. I did not contact my mother. I did not contact my brother. My brother found out anyway. I still don't know who told him. My best guess is someone at the nurse's station who recognized my last name, or possibly my mother had called around until she found the right hospital. Either way, he walked into my room at 7:15 on my second evening there, wearing a jacket that looked new, which told me he was trying to make an impression. He didn't say, "Are you okay?" He said, "Why didn't you call us?" I told him I had it handled. He looked at the monitors, at the IV line, at the tray table with the half-eaten hospital dinner, and then he sat down in the chair by the window without being invited. "You know," he said, "this whole situation with Grandpa's estate, it should have been discussed as a family." "There's nothing to discuss," I said. "It was his will. He made his wishes clear." My brother leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, which is a posture he uses when he's about to say something he's been rehearsing. Grandpa wasn't in his right mind the last couple of years. You know that. The people around him were influencing his decisions. I looked at him for a long moment. The people around him, I said slowly, were me, and his doctor, and Gerald. "Are you suggesting one of us manipulated a 91-year-old man?" He didn't answer that directly. He said, "I'm just saying that a conversation should have happened. Mom is upset. She feels like she was left out of something." I said, "She wasn't in his will. He made that decision." And then I told him I was tired and asked him to leave. He stood up, and I noticed he glanced at the bedside table where my phone was charging, just for a half second, but I noticed. After he left, I called the nurse's station and quietly asked them to note in my file that I was not to have visitors outside of a list I gave them. The charge nurse on duty, a woman named Patrice who I'd met once at a continuing education seminar, handled it without any drama. She also, without me asking, mentioned that my brother had stopped at the desk when he arrived and asked which room I was in. He'd also asked whether I'd had any tests done recently and what they'd found. They hadn't told him anything, but the fact that he'd asked told me plenty. I spent the following morning doing something productive. From my hospital bed with my phone and my laptop, I started going through every account, every document, every shared subscription or financial link that my brother might theoretically have access to. There were fewer than I expected, but there were some. An old joint account from a brief period years ago when we'd split rent on a storage unit. A shared family phone plan that my mother paid for and that I'd been meaning to get off for 2 years. I started untangling each one methodically, the same way I'd approach a complicated patient chart. Gerald called around noon. He'd heard I was in the hospital, which meant my brother had probably called him again. He asked how I was. I told him stable, and then I told him what my brother had said the night before, specifically the part about my grandfather not being in his right mind. There was a brief silence. "I want you to know," Gerald said, "that your grandfather's competency was assessed by 2 independent physicians 18 months ago, at his own request, specifically because he anticipated this kind of challenge. The documentation is thorough. There is no legal ground to stand on." I asked Gerald to make sure those documents were somewhere secure and somewhere I could access easily. He said they already were. That afternoon, a detective came to see me. I hadn't expected that, and for a moment I didn't understand why she was there. She introduced herself as Detective Linda Holt and explained that she was following up on my 911 call from the morning of my admission. "Standard procedure when a young person presents with a cardiac event," she said. She asked about my recent stress levels, my diet, any substances, any new medications. Routine questions, and then she asked something that wasn't routine. She asked whether anyone had access to my apartment in the days before I got sick. I told her I'd had the locks changed 8 months ago and that only I had a key. She wrote something down. She asked whether I'd eaten or drunk anything given to me by someone else recently. I thought about it carefully. I'd had coffee in the break room at work 3 days before. I'd had dinner at a coworker's house the week prior. Nothing from my family. I told her that. She nodded, thanked me, and stood to leave. I asked her what this was about. She paused and said they were just being thorough. Then she left. I lay there for a long time after that, turning the conversation over. I was a nurse. I knew what kinds of things could trigger a cardiac arrhythmia in a young, otherwise healthy person. I knew there were substances that didn't show up on standard panels. I didn't want to believe what my mind was moving toward. But the detective had asked the question, which meant she was moving in the same direction. I called Patrice at the nurse's station and asked her quietly whether anyone from my family had been in the hospital before I was admitted. Whether anyone had asked about me in the days prior. She checked and told me nothing had been logged. But she also told me that my brother had called the main switchboard the morning after his visit, asking about the nature of my cardiac tests. They had told him nothing per HIPAA, but he had called twice. My college friend Diane arrived that evening with a bag from the Thai place near my apartment and the specific energy of someone who has already decided to be useful. She sat in the visitor chair, set the food on the tray table, and looked at me with the particular steady expression she uses when she's worried but doesn't want to show it. I told her everything. About the inheritance, about my brother's visit, about the detective. Diane is an accountant, and therefore processes the world in terms of what is documented and what is not. She listened without interrupting, and then said, "What are you going to do?" I said I was going to get out of this hospital, and then I was going to make sure every single thing that was mine was locked down so tight that my brother couldn't get within a legal mile of it. She nodded and opened the bag of food and told me to eat. I was discharged on day 4 with a clean bill of health, a prescription for a low-dose beta blocker as a precaution, and a follow-up appointment scheduled for 2 weeks out. Dr. Reyes told me the event was most likely stress-induced, possibly compounded by dehydration and a recent change in my sleep schedule. There was no underlying structural issue. She said take it easy, which I heard and immediately disregarded, because I had things to do. My first call from the car was to Gerald. I told him I wanted to move quickly on finalizing the property transfer paperwork and that I wanted everything notarized and recorded within the week. He said he could make that happen. My second call was to a locksmith, who met me at my apartment within the hour. New locks, new deadbolt, new chain. Diane came over and helped me go through my apartment carefully. Not because we thought anything had been disturbed, but because it helped me to look. Everything was as I'd left it. Nothing felt wrong. I started to think maybe I was reading too far into the detective's questions. And then my phone buzzed with a text from my brother. "We should meet. I have some paperwork I'd like you to look at." Paperwork. From my brother, who had no estate claim, no legal standing, and no reason to have paperwork related to anything I owned. I showed the text to Diane. She raised an eyebrow. "Don't go," she said simply. I wasn't planning to. Instead, I forwarded the message to Gerald and asked him what my brother could possibly be trying to do. Gerald called back within 20 minutes. He'd done some checking. My brother had consulted with a probate attorney, one who specialized in will contests. He was apparently building a case around the argument that my grandfather had been unduly influenced. It was thin, Gerald said. Very thin, given the competency documentation. But it wasn't nothing. These challenges can drag on for a year or more, even when they don't succeed. I asked Gerald what my options were to accelerate things. He walked me through them. We could file a motion to have the challenge dismissed preemptively, citing the competency assessments. We could also request an expedited transfer of the liquid assets, since those were the least tied up in any real property questions. Gerald recommended both. I told him to do it. The following days settled into a rhythm. I went back to work, because work was the one place where everything made sense and nothing was about my family. I did my shifts, I took care of my patients, and in the hours in between, I was on the phone with Gerald, or reading through documents, or quietly reaching out to the few people in my professional network who had experience with estate law. My mother called on a Thursday evening. Her tone was softer than the last time, which made me more careful, not less. She said she'd talked to my brother and that he was just trying to protect the family. I said the family didn't need protecting from my grandfather's legal and documented wishes. She said I was being cold. I told her I loved her, which was true in a complicated way, and that I wasn't going to change my position, which was also true. She hung up without saying goodbye. 2 days later, I found out what the paperwork my brother had wanted me to look at actually was. A mutual friend mentioned it casually over coffee, not knowing the full picture. My brother had been telling people in our shared social circle that I was managing our grandfather's estate on behalf of the family and that anyone who wanted to be involved in decisions about the Knoxville property should reach out to him. He'd been positioning himself as a co-administrator of something he had zero legal role in. He'd even mentioned hosting a small gathering at the cabin, describing it as a family event at a shared property. I sat with that for a minute. Then I drove directly to Gerald's office unannounced. He saw me within 10 minutes, because his assistant could apparently read faces. I told him what I'd heard. Gerald's expression didn't change much, but he picked up his phone and called his paralegal into the room. We drafted a letter that afternoon. It was not an angry letter. It was a precise one. It outlined my legal ownership in full, noted that any misrepresentation of my brother's role or authority was potentially fraudulent, and made clear that the cabin was private property and any unauthorized entry would be treated as trespassing. Gerald had it sent certified mail before the day was out. I also made a call that evening to the property management company my grandfather had used for the Nashville house. I introduced myself, provided my documentation, and changed the primary contact on the account to my name alone. The person on the other end was professional and didn't ask questions. I appreciated that. Detective Holt called the following week. She said the investigation into my cardiac event had been closed. There was no evidence of anything other than a naturally occurring episode, and the toxicology had come back clean. She said she was sorry for the intrusion and hoped I was feeling better. I thanked her and asked one question: whether my brother had been looked at as part of the process. She paused just slightly before saying that she couldn't speak to the specifics of the investigation, but that everything had been handled thoroughly. I said I understood. It wasn't a confirmation, but it wasn't a dismissal either, and I filed it in the part of my brain where I keep things I can't resolve but shouldn't forget. The certified letters arrived at my brother's address on a Monday. I know because Gerald got the return receipt that afternoon. My brother called me 4 times in the following 2 hours. I let every call go to voicemail. His messages escalated from reasonable sounding to frustrated to, by the 4th one, something I would characterize as a controlled threat. He said I was making things harder for everyone. He said I would regret acting like the family was beneath me. He said there were things about my grandfather I didn't know, and that when they came out, I'd be embarrassed. I saved every voicemail and forwarded them to Gerald the same evening. Gerald listened to them and said, and I appreciated his restraint, that these would be useful if the will contest moved forward. He also said that the competency challenge had hit its first legal wall. The motion to dismiss had been filed, and the opposing attorney had apparently paused their efforts pending review. In plain terms, my brother's legal play was stalling before it had really started. My brother did not take that quietly. 3 days later, he showed up at my workplace. Not inside, because he couldn't get past the front desk, but in the parking lot, leaning against his car like he'd been waiting for a while. I saw him when I was walking out after a 12-hour shift. I was tired in the specific way that makes everything feel slightly too bright and too loud. And seeing him there used up whatever patience I had left. He started with, "Can we please just talk?" I said there was nothing to talk about until our attorneys had finished talking. He said this didn't need to be legal. I said he'd made it legal the moment he walked into a probate attorney's office. He said I was acting like a stranger. I said I was acting like someone protecting what was legally hers. He got louder then, not quite shouting, but close. He said I'd always thought I was better than him and that our grandfather had chosen me to punish him for something he'd never even done. He said the cabin should have come to him because he was the oldest and that was how things worked. His voice cracked in a way I'd never heard before, and I realized underneath all of it he wasn't angry exactly. He was humiliated. He had expected the inheritance, and he hadn't gotten it, and that had shattered something in his understanding of how the world was supposed to work. I looked at him for a long moment. I felt sorry for him, genuinely, in the way you feel sorry for someone who has chosen the wrong premise for their entire life and is only now being asked to reckon with it. But feeling sorry for someone does not mean handing them something that isn't theirs. I told him clearly and quietly that I hoped one day he'd understand that our grandfather's decision wasn't about punishing him, that maybe it was something simpler and harder than that it was about who had actually shown up. And then I got in my car and drove home. He didn't follow me. He didn't call that night. And for the first time in several weeks, my phone stayed quiet. Gerald called 2 days later with news I'd been waiting for. The probate challenge had been formally dropped. My brother's attorney had filed a withdrawal of the contest, citing insufficient grounds. The estate transfer was proceeding on schedule. The properties would be in my name by the end of the month, and the accounts were already under my sole control. Gerald said he'd never had a case resolve this cleanly in this short a time. I told him to send me his invoice and that he'd earned it. I took a day off the following week. Not because I needed to recover from anything specific, but because I'd promised myself I would when this was over. I drove up to the cabin outside Knoxville on a Thursday morning when the light was still low and the trees along the highway were turning. My grandfather had bought that land when he was 34 years old, a few years younger than I was now. He'd built the cabin himself with help from a friend, and he'd told me once that the whole point of it was to have one place in the world where nothing was complicated. I parked in the gravel lot, unlocked the front door, and walked through each room slowly. The same hand-braided rug in the living room, the same shelf of paperbacks by the fireplace, most of them dog-eared in the same spots because he read his favorites more than once. The kitchen with the window over the sink that looked out into the tree line, and the small pond beyond it. I stood at that window for a long time. I thought about the phone call that had started all of this, the attorney's careful voice, the numbers that hadn't seemed real, the cold dread that had followed the wonder. I thought about the hospital room and the detective's questions, and my brother in the parking lot with his voice cracking. I thought about all the ways this could have gone differently if I had panicked, or given in, or decided the money wasn't worth the fight. It wasn't actually about the money. I think I understood that fully standing in my grandfather's kitchen. It was about the fact that he had known me well enough to trust me. And the only way to honor that was to make sure I deserved it. I built a fire in the fireplace that afternoon because the October air was sharp, and I sat in the chair my grandfather always used and read one of the paperbacks from the shelf. I didn't check my phone for 3 hours. No calls came that I needed to answer. On the drive back that evening, I thought about what came next. Not defensively, not in terms of who might come at me next, but forward-looking, in terms of what I actually wanted to do with what I had. There were things I'd put off for years, because money had always been tight, and time had always been limited. There were people I wanted to help and ideas I hadn't let myself take seriously. None of that needed to be decided that night. But it could be. The legal fight had taken less than 2 months from start to finish. The emotional weight of it would take longer to settle. But the ground under me was solid now, and I had built enough walls and earned enough clarity to know the difference between a real threat and an echo of one. My brother has not reached out since the day in the parking lot. My mother called once to say she was sorry for how things had gone. which I accepted because I know she means it even when she doesn't follow through. Diane and I got dinner last Friday at the Thai place, and she did not bring up any of it, which was exactly what I needed. I go back to work on Monday. I have a follow-up with Dr. Reyes on Tuesday. The beta blocker prescription sits on my bathroom counter, and I take it every morning without Some things require ongoing maintenance, and that's fine. My grandfather used to say that the people who love you without wanting something from you are the ones worth keeping close. I was young when he first said that, and I thought it was the kind of thing adults said that didn't really mean much. I understand it now. I understand it in the specific way that you only understand things that have cost you something. He left me everything because I showed up. Not just at the end, but for 31 years, in small ways, consistently. That was the whole reason. It wasn't complicated at all.